Greetings, everyone. This is David Gambill with the host of Be Your Own Boss. We have an episode here with Kevin Meredith from California. His company is forcesysteminnovation.com. It's his website, and kind of go into a little bit more your background and how you got into your current position that you have for yourself.
Yeah, so my obsession in life is innovation. So every single thing that I do almost all day long, every day, is somehow anchored in innovation and not just this shiny stuff that comes out like with our cell phones and new software and all that. It is all the hard and grimy stuff that it takes to get there. That's what I really focus on. And so the origin of that really goes back to my time as an engineering student at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And quite frankly, I don't remember ever hearing the word innovation in any way that stuck with me as an engineering student. So, like, understood how engineers are expected to convert kind of science into solutions, but we didn't explicitly think of ourselves in an innovation context when I was getting my degree. And so I went and worked for the Boeing company for the start of my career. And it was only about halfway into my journey at Boeing that I became aware that innovation was more than just some ancillary term tied to innovation or to engineering, and that it was a formal discipline, and that you could do it, you could practice it, you could get better at it, you could try new things and lead new ways to think about innovation. And that's the origin of my obsession. Is I had an amazing vice president general manager that basically said, okay, Boeing is a 100-year-old company, at least knocking on the door of being 100 years at that time. And what do we need to do to be an amazing company for the next 100 years? Like, we literally help put people on the moon. What are we going to do in the future? Like, what systems and processes and methodologies do we need to employ to make Boeing continue to push the boundaries of human capability long into the future? And that sandbox was the most amazing place for me to kind of learn about innovation. So I had exposure to all the rigor and processes that Boeing has used to innovate for that first 100 years, and the flexibility to go see what other people in the world are doing, whether it's Silicon Valley or other competitors in aerospace and beyond. What are they doing to drive innovation? And that was the most amazing foundry for me to develop as a student of innovation, and ultimately to support what we continue to do today outside of Boeing. And that is to use a systems approach to understand innovation and make sure that the precious resources that every innovation activity, endeavor, or project program has is translating to more and more outcomes of the innovation approach. So
I
that
mean, okay,
that is the core.
yeah. So personally, what made you depart Boeing, right? So
Yeah,
if innovation was the next century for Boeing,
yeah.
what drove you from that, and why did you go out and do what you're doing now?
So I think there's a number of factors that play into that. Some were personal and some were professional. The On the professional side, even though I was given this amazing sandbox to play in, it doesn't mean that the entirety of the company saw this same future, right? And at the time that I left Boeing in 2015, the company was sitting on $500 billion in backlog, primarily in its commercial airplane division. So the push from the most senior levels of leadership, and rightfully so, I'm not second guessing this in any way, is execute on our current commitments to our customers because we're sitting on $500 billion of backlog. So where we need to vector our innovation would be on the production system and getting outcomes so that our customers get airplanes in their hands faster, right? Totally agree with that. But at the same time, a statement is made at the highest levels of the company that essentially says no more moonshots. And this is coming to an organization that literally helped put people on the moon. And so employees that had a role in that were still working at the company at that time. They were very well on in their career, but they were still working. And so for me, it was an indication that what I was working on may not be shared across the enterprise as far as a priority to where things really could go and how the company can move forward. And so that was a deciding factor. It's like, as you get more and more experience, I don't know if you can really do this early on without understanding the organization, but there's this term of like, can you read the writing on the wall, right? Can you see what's coming before it comes? And I had enough kind of cycles inside of the company to start seeing some of that writing on the wall, and made the decision that this was probably a good time for me to try and go do this thing on my own. Can I employ all the learning and assimilate all the insights that we developed over this in this sandbox and translate it to value beyond Boeing and beyond aerospace? And so started a company called the We See Collective, and We See is an acronym for Wellness, Education, Society, Ethics, and the Environment. And our whole focus is to try and drive value creation beyond profit. So it's not an indictment against profit, but saying over time, we believe these other principles will have as much weight as profit in how business is sustained. And we were excited to start exploring that. But I didn't have a background explicitly in that. I had my engineering background, and I was finishing up an MBA focused on entrepreneurship from Pepperdine University at that same time. But my comfort was in innovation. So we started doing innovation consulting. So the business unit that we developed was fourth sector innovations to continue that innovation work outside of Boeing. And that was 10 years ago. This is our 10-year anniversary right now.
So I mean, from that, did you see? You kind of mentioned the disagreement with leadership within Boeing as the approach. So there was no voice in leadership to say we needed incubator to be able to do that, or was there just no willingness from a personal level to even do this as like a venture capital adventure? Uh,
So let's see. I was in Boeing's corporate venturing group at the time, and that was another piece of this reading the writing on the wall. And the way that that venturing group was structured was basically stay out of the core. Like, go figure out these new billion-dollar opportunities that a company the size of Boeing should be considering and looking and interested in. But by the way, it can't be anything that messes with our current customers, that really has anything to do with things that fly. So that at its core presented its own opportunities and challenges. And the like a company the size of Boeing, 100 billion a year in revenue at that time, with a little bit more skewed towards the commercial side of the business than the defense side of the business, that meant that these opportunities would not, they're funded by the core businesses, but they're not necessarily in the best interest of the direct businesses that are funding them. So secondarily, most of the decisions had to go all the way up to like the exco level to get approved. So this is like the highest level in the entire Boeing company that are making decisions, ultimately that could have an impact, but are inconsequential at the level that they are in any meaningful way at that time, right? So there's, and that is not uncommon to Boeing. There's a lot. There's, if you look at generally what's happened over the last 10 years in corporate venturing, we see less internally run corporate venturing arms and more partnerships with existing investment organizations, whether they be private equity, VC. So that that has kind of continued to propagate its way through the startup or the corporate innovation and corporate venturing systems
So
around
yeah,
the
so
U.S.
just the R&D business or R&D process improvement started to be disassociated from the main core business that Boeing had.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was like in
Was that
growth.
I wouldn't say it was intentional, but I think that's just the way the market and the businesses started to want to be operating because they wanted to make sure that they're focused on the customer and the base that they had and to keep on supplying the products they have delivered, like you mentioned, over 1 trillion in back orders. So
Yeah, for sure.
that's where their bread's coming from. So they don't want to upset the apple cart,
Yeah,
which I can understand as well.
totally. I mean, look, if I was the CEO of Boeing at the time, I probably would come to the same conclusion. I just maybe would do it. I would have a different strategy in how we do it. And I would say, instead of saying no more moonshots, I would say, hey, let's create the moonshot that allows us to deliver this backlog in an unprecedented high level of quality in as shortest time possible, right? Like, to say it like that, take all this amazing innovation capability that we've developed over decades and decades, half a century or more, and translate that into helping our customers be more successful as fast and with as high a quality as possible. And I think that's a different message than what was, I don't know if that was different than what was intended to be transmitted, but it was definitely it was a different message than what was received.
All right. So once you left and you started your own business, what was some of the challenges and some of the aha moments
Yeah.
that you learned from being in that outside of that big corporate bubble
Yeah.
that you had to face that you didn't think was going to be there?
So I think there's some things that translated very well. So like the approach, a systems approach to innovation, we found actually had more applications after leaving Boeing than when we were thinking about it inside of Boeing. And at the time inside of Boeing, we were calling this approach to innovation organic innovation. And it was this idea of grassroots, employee led, and executive driven coming together organically through the processes, systems, and methods that we were facilitating. Um, so we took a step back from that when we left, like outside of Boeing. When you talk about organic growth, for example, in strategy, that usually means internal research and development leads to your next phase of growth. But that wasn't that was limiting to what we were trying to do because we were looking at partnerships and think interesting ways to pull in existing technology and use it and apply it in a different way. And so the notion of doing that as like grassroots from the ground up or organically out in the marketplace, when you talk about growth for a company, there's organic growth and acquisition, right? And what what we were seeing often is when we talk about organic innovation, people would just throw it in a bucket versus and think that it has no application in mergers and acquisitions, in which that's a great way to accelerate and de-risk innovation and growth in many circumstances. Not foolproof, but in many. And so we changed the language, and so we started calling it an integrated innovation system. But the bones of that system are the same as what we had been working on inside of Boeing. We just called it something other than organic innovation. And that happened within the first few months of of leaving. And I think that was significant because it was relatively confusing outside of an internal corporate existence to talk about organic innovation and have it mean something other than what strategists and change makers consider when you say the word organic in that setting.
Yeah, I mean, you mean grassroots, but you got to have capital to support that grassroots, right? It doesn't catch fire unless it has some type of fuel,
Right.
per se. So is that, I know you being in California, close to Silicon Valley. I know you're further south than that, but it still has that permeation throughout California. But I see the rest of the country not have that type of connection, that's so unique to the Silicon Valley, the north, the coast of California. Outside of that, damn it, myself being in Pennsylvania, I don't see that um, organic growth as much. I'd like to see more of it, but it takes a certain caliber of education, of promotion, to get that to kind of, and I think you turn to incubate,
Yeah.
incubate it, because it does take the fuel, to start it, but then again, you need to keep fueling it with funding and and um, and I know I just don't mean people coming out of college. I mean anybody at any age,
Yeah. Right.
having
You know,
an
and
idea.
the mean age for a startup in the US is between 38 and 42 years old. So, you know, the the narrative is the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world create Facebook in college, and that makes up a majority of the startup activity. When in fact, it is not the majority that come through early career. Like college and early career ideas. A majority of people get experience in an industry or a collection of work experiences, and oftentimes what we see is they get frustrated in the roles that they're in and feel like they're not being heard. So then they're like, oh, I think I could do a startup. They have enough domain expertise. They've seen a pattern of problems that have emerged over time and think, you know what, there could be a solution here. And so that usually puts them further along into their career, to that early mid to late portion when they're ready to commit and really pull the trigger on that.
Well, I think, tell me how what the problems and gates people have to go through to find that funding. My experience has always been with startups with eVTOLs, just the electrification
Yeah.
in general. And it's hard to find those ones willing to put up that type of funding. Not, software is easy. I always talk to people in software says, oh yeah, I can easily get software updated because there's no physical hardware associated with it because it's all based on the internet. But when it comes to physical hardware, physical, requirements, certification, and it takes a lot of momentum, to be able to get that niche into the funding market.
Yeah. And I wouldn't go so far as to say like software is easy. I think the commercialization, the conversion of any idea into, a market, you use the word kind of like fuel the fire, but a term that I learned at Boeing from an individual that was consulting in the venturing group. His name is David Kidder, and he had this term economic oxygen, and that term has continued to resonate with me, and so we reference that term all the time. So thank you, David. But the the notion is this is basically product market fit, right? And it's not just you've demonstrated it once that one customer wants it. This ongoing economic oxygen that drives that growth and demonstrates that the solution that you've come up with is satisfying a number of conditions, including solving a problem that people are willing to pay for.
Well, you hit on the word solutions. A lot of times software is easy to, throw out software,
Yeah.
fix it on the
Yeah.
way and do revisions.
And I didn't answer your question. So hardware is hard. All right. Like if
There is levels difference between software and hardware. It's easier to make faults and stuff and errors in software and fix it. It's harder if you have a hardware that has an issue with it, right? SpaceX is a good example. They have a lot of, you know, things that go boom that they learn from. Hopefully, that boom doesn't cause somebody saying they don't know what they're doing and I'm not giving them more money.
what is it?
Whereas a
Unplanned
software, you
maintenance.
kind of like you can hide it better because it
Yeah.
doesn't physically cause distress to a
Although
certain
some
extent.
of the software issues that we see happening on aircraft, even right, can
Yeah.
can have a real big impact on. But it's that interface between the software and the hardware that ultimately translates into significant issues, right? And so I think
Well,
one
yeah.
of the things that we've learned along the way is interfaces are a crucial place where problems occur. And so whether it's a communication interface, like if my network drops out right now, that interface to allow us to have this conversation is seriously damaged, right? Riverside has a great solution because they locally record it and then they merge it up together, right? So that they understand how important that interface is to have high quality feed on both sides of the discussion, right? The interface problems can also happen at a physical interface, a physical barrier. And if you look at where most things fail, it's at that interface between two different materials or two different components coming together. And that can be a really important insight as far as innovators and entrepreneurs trying to identify where challenges lie so that they can more meaningfully produce opportunity in response and create those solutions.
Well, that's and where lies the innovation, right? Because without that, you wouldn't know. Like I was reading somewhere the other day about, um, you know, fault or what we consider an issue or a mistake
Yep.
could result in an innovative miracle or uh, something something unique that didn't
Yeah,
happen
totally.
before just because of the mistake.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, the number one example of that that almost always is cited is post-it notes, right? So they, for those that aren't familiar with it, and I'm going to paraphrase it to a large degree, but the scientist that was working on this basically created a not very sticky adhesive and was like, what the heck are we going to do with this? And kind of stumbled across this idea that if you temporarily wanted to adhere something, this might be a good formula to do that. And ultimately that's how the post-it note was conceived and became so incredibly successful in the marketplace. I will say most of the time coming up with a solution to go find a problem is a difficult path and oftentimes leads to more failure than success on the final accounting of that approach. But at the same time, giving people the flexibility to explore things without necessarily knowing what they want to happen out the other side. Like, oh, well, what could we do with this? Having the awareness that this is not what we thought it was going to be, but there still could be a use for it. That creative exploration is crucial to innovation ultimately. Because if everybody is just thinking about the same things in the same way and doing the same equation to get an output, we're going to see we could still see a lot of innovation, but we're not going to see the the types of innovation that are more differentiated when we all come at it the same way and apply the same norms in order to solve the problem. So the definition that we use for innovation is the conversion of creativity into value for stakeholders. And so that creativity piece that you had mentioned is absolutely core. The other part that I think is equally as important, though, is value. So we could sit here all day and just come up with new ideas. And that would be fun for a while. And then if we did that 100 days in a row, that probably will get old, right? We have to convert the ideas into value. And if we don't create value, and if we don't create meaningful value for a large enough population, then we won't have that economic oxygen, right? And we won't be able to ultimately have the greatest impact that we want to have in realizing the innovations that we come up with and translating them into widespread success and impact.
Do you think that there is a, and I'm, how do you do that without, even if that you just come up with ideas?
Yeah.
You know, there's this big push for bringing up patents, right? IP, right? Corporations like IP because that gives them value, even though it's not, may not be related to production or the product that they have. Just the idea of it is a value to the company. How is that that wouldn't be something that you would want to do and have, and I don't know if this is what a think tank is, but it would be something that you that you kind of avoid yourself a risk, because a lot of times corporations, like you mentioned before, kind of like draw it to the bottom line. Well, we can't take that risk because I don't want to go down that path. But yet, oh wait, but we need the IP to have us a better situation as valuation on the markets.
Yeah.
Has that gone to the wayside, you think? I mean, from a perspective
Yeah.
that, have we turned this in back to the individuals creating these ideas, or is the corporation still wanting to have that? I know startups like it because that generates a lot of the value for the funding rounds.
Yeah.
But big corporations tend to be like they're kind of mute to it now. They'll just buy it once it gets to a certain stage.
So
Uh,
I think there's a lot to unpack there. In general, I am not a big proponent of using patents and intellectual property more broadly as a proxy for innovation. Where I see innovation playing a key role is brokering between ideas and inventions, patents, if you will, and the marketplace. There's nothing when you just got a patent, it's hanging on the wall behind you, right? Was there anything in your patent application that requires you to commercialize it?
no, no. I mean, it's strictly an idea that has an application.
Great.
That's all it
So
is.
so that's what you're documenting, and ultimately through the patent process, that's what you are paying the privilege to monopolize for a defined set of circumstances and time period, right? That's what a patent is. And so the idea that, oh, we'll just amass all these patents and that'll prove how innovative we are, either by developing them internally or buying patent portfolios or buying companies outright because of their portfolios, all of these strategies, I think it has more to do with risk and positioning in the marketplace than it actually does around innovation. And one of the examples is, it still is happening, but like these patent trolls, right? Not a very favorable term, but I don't think what they do is necessarily all that favorable either. But they'll just go out and consume patents, amass patents strictly for the purpose of either actively litigating against somebody or for protecting themselves against litigation against others. And it's the trolls that are really going out and actively interrogating versus using it as a protection. As far as startups go, the point about investability, the language that's common today is we want to have a moat for our startups, right? So typically IP is that moat. And the moat is just like you would envision it being a medieval castle, right? It's a area that protects those that are inside the castle from what's outside of the castle. And that's what you're trying to do with a moat. And typically through IP as a startup, you're protecting um, the time frame from which others can, if you have this novel approach and this novel solution in the marketplace that is being received well, you've got a longer period of time that you can operate without people fully being able to replicate. Now, there's lots of creative people out there. There's lots of places around the world that don't honor intellectual property protections in one region to another. And so, it's not a foolproof way to ensure that, but it's a layer of protection. Just like you wouldn't only have a moat on a castle, you would have a moat and you would have some guards and you would have some armaments and you would have a whole suite of things that you do. The moat is kind of the general term though for those protections in the marketplace for a startup.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the success of a startup is dependent on finding the right idea, finding this whole marketing approach as far as finding innovators, finding first starters, people that really want it,
Yeah.
and then getting it into mass market. So I mean, for
But I
all
would
this,
say from an innovation perspective, it's not always about getting it into mass market. So from an internal, like a corporate innovation perspective, oftentimes it's identifying those things, whether they're continuous improvement or larger scale impact, and translating them into broader use within an enterprise, within the corporation. And so widespread adoption of these innovations within a corporate's four walls can have huge impact, and that's never going to see a commercialization path necessarily. There are exceptions to that even. Amazon developed AWS for its own internal purposes, its own operational effectiveness, and then realized that this is really exceptional. People were like knocking on the door, how are you doing this? And they're like, oh, we could sell this. And they became the global leader in cloud compute in almost overnight in an extremely fast and short period of time. So sometimes it translates, but I like to use the broader framing that it's about widespread adoption and commercialization where you can see the biggest impact.
yeah. Well, before I forget, I wanted to ask you about your trip that you made to
Yeah.
Africa, and kind of give us a kind of like an overview why you did that,
Yeah.
and kind of compare it back to your experience within the U.S. and how that compares.
So the trip originally started off as I got asked to do a keynote and workshop for SAPEX, which is the largest supply chain conference on the continent of Africa. And I had already booked my travel and had that all arranged. And then I had learned uh, through the Holt Prize, actually, which is the world's largest student startup competition. We had a local entrant to the US's down selection, the finals for the US representative. We had a Chapman University student, and her venture is called Everleaf, uh, about organic tea experiences. So we brought she won the Chapman competition to get the right to go to the national competition. And at that national competition, we got to meet other program leaders of other universities, one of which Kwame leads Dartmouth social enterprise and entrepreneurship activities. We hit it off, and then we were following up and just saying, hey, how's everything going post Holt competition? And it turns out he has a nonprofit. He's from Ghana, and he has a nonprofit focused on decreasing the amount of graduates from computer science in Ghana that can't find a job after graduation. Guess what that number is today
Of computer engineers?
of computer scientists, tech that don't get a job after they finish their degree in Ghana. 90%. Only 10% get
Get
a
a
job
job.
in their field. So his major focus is called Tech Stripped and Tech Stripped Africa, is to change that equation in Ghana and to then help it scale across the continent more broadly. And so he put together this program, this techpreneurship program, a 1 week boot camp, and he asked me to join him in country in Ghana. And this program was sponsored by the US State Department and the Mandela Washington Fellowship. And so this is an ongoing program that's all about developing entrepreneurs and the leaders, the young leaders of Africa more broadly. So our focus is on entrepreneurs in tech, but broadly speaking, across the program, it's not just about entrepreneurship in tech. It's finding, identifying, and supporting emerging leaders in Africa to be their best and have their greatest impact locally and globally. So that program, I got asked to support and spent a week in Ghana. I I had never been to Africa, period, and then spent most of June in Africa between South Africa. The conference was in Cape Town. Did a little bit of time on safari at Kruger, was in Ethiopia, and then spent a big chunk of time in Ghana. And so it was just so much of that trip was eye-opening and amazing, and not in the ways that you kind of think or expect it to be. It really was inspiring and helped me realign some of what we think should or shouldn't happen with a given set of circumstances. And the what I mean by that is, in Ghana, almost every day there was some kind of power failure, right? The power would go out. It's really hard to have internet if you have no power, right? So then we would not have data. Um, Really hard for a software provider to have a business in which there's not a reliable source of power for them to offer their solutions, right? So things that we take for granted, by and large, here in the US, like a power outage in the US is a relatively rare event for most people. In Ghana, it was a daily occurrence. And this was at one of the most advanced technical schools in the country. So it's not like we were in some remote area where you wouldn't expect to have constant power and data. And we were like in a hub, right? So it made me, and because of the programming that we were doing around entrepreneurship and tech, it made me naturally reflect on, okay, so what are these similarities and differences that we're seeing around entrepreneurs and innovators in Ghana versus what I'm used to in the US primarily, right? And so we referred back to the definition of entrepreneurship, which, unlike the definition of innovation that we've developed over years, I haven't found a better definition for entrepreneurship than that of Professor Howard Stevenson. And his definition of entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources you currently control. And the beauty of that definition, like if you anchor it back in my experience in corporate, so many leaders were like, we're a 100-year-old company, or we're X-year-old company, we're never going to be a startup again, so why are we talking about entrepreneurship? But if you frame entrepreneurship in terms of an entrepreneurial mindset that Professor Stevenson's definition leans into, it becomes a leadership attribute. Like, what leader on the planet wouldn't want their employees to achieve more than what they should, and to do it by doing more than what the resources they currently have in their pockets or in their budgets or in their coffers, right? So that's inspiring that it can apply whether it's a 100-year-old company or a 100-hour company.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard the term and reinvent yourself, right? It's
Yeah.
like, how many times I've seen like IBM or Xerox, or even in the case of Nintendo, right?
Yep.
You would never have known the origins of Nintendo, uh, to say that they basically have built in everything, right? And gaming is all we recognize them for right now.
Right.
But they've built appliances, they've built refrigerators back in the day, and other things.
Yeah.
So they were continually reinventing. So to say that you're just an airplane company is kind of short-sighted from my perspective. If you can't evolve, right? Corporation should evolve. If
Yeah.
it's been around for 100 years, it needs to evolve to
Because
something
what
different.
we see is in general, if you look at the S&P 500, over time, the median age of those that are tracked on the S&P 500 has decreased from 50 plus years in the mid 1900s to today. I think the average is 15 or less years. So those 100-year-old companies are dying off, right? And those that are still here may or may not have it in their DNA to be here another 100 years. But some of the ones that you've identified have demonstrated that it's possible to to be relevant and be able to provide the value that you're best at providing with that type
Which
of.
Yeah, which goes back what you're saying before, which is it's a part of your character as far as leadership
Yeah.
to say, hey, we need to do something different. And we can't let, as the old saying, you can't rest on your laurels. You can't place all, I could go into more, you can't put all your eggs in one basket because it, you just don't know what tomorrow brings.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that second revenue stream that, you may be okay today, but you don't know what the outcome is of whatever the market is, whatever this flip of the switch when it goes to, you know, incidents or accidents or environmental or the a new wigamajig that's coming out that's going to really captivate. Because I've seen in the past, I won't mention it here, where sometimes companies suppress progression or progress or innovation
Yeah.
because they don't want it to overtake their own products.
Yeah. And that, it's a very real struggle, right? So, but oftentimes, if in the framing that you had talked about Boeing in, you know being a company that builds things that fly, right? Some of the language that they were using at the time was to connect and protect people around the world, right? And I think some of that continues through Boeing's kind of mission and purpose, broader purpose statements that exist today. And so, if that's really how you see your role in the world, that is a broader purpose than just people moving from point A to point B in a tube with wings, right? If you really are committed to being a leader in how people connect and they're protected around the world, there's a almost infinite number of places to explore, which is both empowering and intimidating, right? And so for some people, it's easier to say, "Oh no, we're not going to let the genie get out of the bottle or Pandora to get out of the box." Analogy we want to use here, like we're not going to open Pandora's box. We're going to do everything we can to use the mass of our influence to keep that thing shut because it directly challenges our ability to go from point A to point B with tubes that have wings, right? Instead of saying, "Oh no, if we really embrace this, we can continue to be a leader in connecting and protecting people around the world."
I
And
mean,
so
we
like
could,
that
yeah,
job
and
to
that,
be done framework, what is it that we're really trying to do, right?
right. I mean, I could go into organizations and stuff, and just the way the final bottom line is. Toyota, I believe, is either Toyota or Honda came out with they're in the mobility, right? They're getting people from point A to point B. Which, if you look at Honda, they got the Honda Jet. They've
They've got
got cars.
jets and
Um,
scooters, and they're working on eVTOLs and
yeah. So their emphasis is on point A to point B, getting people there safe. Which transport, it could be a ground, it could be over. I don't think they may be making boats. I don't know. But there's that
engines for watercraft. I know that. I don't know if they make a full platform or not. I
vehicle.
would imagine they do, but I don't know off the top of my head.
But that's that's it goes back to the basis on your company as the why, right? Why are you in business for?
Yeah,
I could go into to Apple, and they're not necessarily a computer company. They want to be able to put the power in the individual's hands,
yeah,
right? But where people matter, and people with the things in their hands get them to the knowledge that they need to do their jobs,
yeah.
rather than being a computer company,
I
right?
think ultimately, these these and you go through a whole litany of different size organizations and their interests. But let's just take automation, right? So like when we intentionally restrict automation, whether we're talking about this latest boom of large language models and um, neural networks and machine learning more broadly that's happening today, or like in the 80s and the 90s with automation in the factories of our automotive industry primarily. When you work to artificially restrain those types of values, they usually pop up with greater impact when it's less favorable for you to deal with them, right?
Right, right, right.
And, and so the tricky balance is that self-preservation mixed with what got us here may not get us there, right? And how you effectively navigate that can be incredibly challenging and is not as easy as developing some algorithm to always follow, do this, then this, then this, and you're in the clear into the blue ocean, right? So I I just think it is a lot to do with the framing, like you're saying, and really honoring the purpose that you have. And to be honest, when you're up against that purpose and to kind of hold yourself accountable when you're up against that purpose. So like an example here in Southern California, we used to have decent public transportation. We had a trolley system in downtown LA. We had a lot of utilization and essentially, and I don't know the history deeply, but it's my understanding that a major player in the automotive industry took a majority stake in it and ripped it all up because it was a threat to having more automobiles on the roads and people. And so now California has one of the most entrenched car cultures on the planet. After decades and decades of this kind of reinforcing itself, we've got huge urban sprawl throughout Los Angeles. We've got some infrastructure and it's growing on a regular basis, but I don't think utilization is skyrocketing on our public transportation system. And so, the repercussions of these things on society are not always in society's best interest.
Yeah, you could start adding in a lot of the community purposes, and that should fall into the same parts of leadership, right? It's not it's a holistic approach, not just the corporation, but just your environment and the community that you're supposedly supporting,
Yes.
right? Because you're there to employ people that are in the community, and we could go to a whole different subject on that. I know we're kind of getting on the after 50-minute mark.
Yeah.
Um, you're always good to talk to, Kevin. I'd love to continue to discuss this because there's plenty other topics in this kind of leadership, innovation, just the mindset for community. How do we develop all this new technology into the kind of the ecosphere, or the sphere of I guess I call it sphere of the community, because it's all one. And when you start to like pocket it, or you start to, like you mentioned before about mass transit, and you start to make my pocket bigger so I can get rid of this other thing that maybe not in the best interest of everybody, um, it really tells how a character of a business really is represented within the community,
Yeah.
right? Any final words before we close out?
I think just a couple of things. One, this notion of externalities. There's positive and negative externalities that go unaccounted for in our immediate decisions every single day. That's for us as individuals and us as organizations that we lead and support, right? It takes more energy and effort to consider those things and to mitigate the impact of negative externalities and to amplify positive externalities by default. And the if you look at, for example, Roundup, right, or these other forever chemicals, the companies that developed them and then sold them to another company and sold them to another company, and like that is increasingly existential risk to those companies. So I think Bayer, the German company, now owns, they bought it from Monsanto, and they had the potential legal risk of just that product alone could shut down the entirety of Bayer. And I think they've come to some agreements to mitigate that risk to a certain degree. But the idea that we can just push this stuff off, and if you look at the the tobacco industry, if you look at leaded gasoline, if you look at things over history, you see this cycle repeated again and again, where it's easier, it's cheaper, I get a better unit economic return if I use these additives, or if I do this, versus if I have to have other processes to make my product better, right? For the system as a whole. So I think just the importance of all of us individually and collectively to drive kind of the consideration of externalities and to not just sweep them under the rug, because they will, again, and there's positive and negative externalities. So try and identify those things with positive externalities that will actually amplify your value, and try and ensure that future potential negative externalities are understood and mitigated to the greatest extent possible. And that ties me back to your question and discussion around Africa and some of the key. So we talked about the definition of entrepreneurship and the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources in your immediate control, or currently control. Talked about how beautiful that definition is for so many reasons. But the other side of like reading between the lines of what that definition doesn't say but implies is something that really hit home with me on this trip to Africa. And that is, we have a responsibility to utilize the resources we do have, to the ones we do control, to the greatest effect possible. So with as little waste as possible, to optimize utilization is what isn't written in that definition but is implied. Like, why are we going out to pursue opportunity beyond what we have if we're not fully utilizing what we do have? We need to really honor the fact that we in the US, this is what's so inspiring about the trip to Africa, we have so much. And we, individually and collectively, are not doing everything we can with those resources. And I don't care if that's AI, you know, utilizing LLMs. Most people are doing what? Like building social media campaigns with LLM. Like that's the number one use case of LLMs right now. It's like, is that really the best use of this amazing technology? So we as individuals can control how and when we use these tools and could get so much more out of them if we honored the fact that these are incredible resources. Our cell phones, we're just death scrolling, doom scrolling all day, right? And it's like
Yeah.
that that cell phone is 10 million times more powerful than the navigation computer that put humans on the moon. And are we doing anything close to 10 million times more important when we're scrolling through our feeds with that? Like, so it's up to us to figure out, to understand what we're doing, and to have the right behaviors to get the most out of it. And that is whether you consider yourself an entrepreneur, an innovator or not. We all have that responsibility, and we have so much here, not in
Well,
a, oh, like you're not doing enough. It's like, no, we have so much, let's do more. Like, it's inspiring to me that we're really just getting started in figuring out how to optimize the resources we have and to drive the impact that will propel potentially the US into another 100, 200 years of global leadership. Instead of focusing on this dichotomy of what was and what is, like, no, just honor, hey, look around you. Look at all the amazing resources you have, whether it's the roads, the data access, whatever it is. Just look around you and you will see abundance.
that's
Leverage
right.
that abundance that is in your grasp, because that's what you control. So use it, and don't be shy about how awesome that future can be when we fully employ our resources and get the most out of them. And we can talk about
We can talk
getting
about that.
of what we don't have, right? And like
Right.
creating that future that we all deserve. So
Yep, exactly right. I appreciate it, Kevin. All right.
yeah,
That concludes the interview with Kevin and Meredith, and appreciate it with
David, and thank you for
and Kevin Nations, just .com, and please subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, man.
thank you for the talk.